Hi, welcome to another lecture in social neuroscience. This is lecture 22, and we're going to be covering morality some more. So this is the second part of a two-part lecture on morality that corresponds with chapter 13 in Sapolsky's book. And in this lecture, I'm going to be focusing much more just about moral decision making and research around using paradigms that look at moral decisions. I'll begin with some philosophy, then we'll look at moral decisions at the neural level. We'll talk about moral decisions in genetics a little bit. We'll talk about moral decisions in culture. And finally, to sort of get us ready for the next two lectures, which will be about empathy, I want to talk about the problem with empathy and moral decision making. So where I left off at the last lecture was talking about this interesting study by Green and Paxton in 2009, where they looked at people who lie or tell the truth. And what they found was that in that particular study, you remember, is that dishonest people, when they were having to report how they had done in the study, and they would go ahead and they had actually looked like they had done some lying, that they actually showed more activity in control areas of the brain, whereas people who gave honest answers showed no such activity, no such control. That is, honesty seemed to come naturally to them, so there wasn't anything that they had to worry about, whereas people who are more dishonest, they may have to exert control over what they say, so that sometimes they need to say the dishonest answer so that they don't get disapproval, or they give you an honest answer, but whatever it is, they have to think more about it. They have to control more of their sort of like regular answer they might have. So they have to have some will, some control over what they say and do. So that kind of suggests then that maybe some people are more honest overall, just in everyday life, and other people are more dishonest. And that leads us then to today talking about some philosophy. And I'm going to give you some real basic philosophy here that obviously is a very, very short introduction to moral philosophy. And what I'm specifically focuses on is the sort of Western view of moral philosophy. And this question about what's the optimal moral philosophy? Is it enough that we have good consequences even if we were bad along the way? It's sort of like what the question is here. So there are these big three, the big three theories of moral philosophy that I'm going to cover. And it's also talked about a little bit by Sapolsky. One is virtue ethics, another one is deontology, and finally it's utilitarianism or consequentialism. So let's take the first one. What's virtue ethics? Well, the basic idea behind virtue ethics is what makes a good or a bad person. And virtue ethicists define good people as those who have virtues that they have cultivated and practiced over time and have these qualities in just the right amount. So it's saying that basically what a good person is a person who has a lot of good virtues, and they just have just the right amount. They're kind of like those people in the study I was just telling you about, the Green and Paxton study, where you've got some people who have by grace actually are just honest because that's what naturally comes to them. And so the idea here is that people perform good behaviors or bad behaviors because of nature and nurture. They just become good or they become bad. And this whole idea of virtue ethics goes all the way back to Aristotle. So if you want to read more about that and understand more about virtue ethics, you can go to that. Unfortunately, virtue ethics isn't really covered as much these days by moral neuroscientists. So we're going to talk about some of the morality and neuroscience here today, and they don't tend to look at virtue ethics very much, right? But one thing I can mention is a study here by Green, that was Green's lab, and Green, by the way, is at Harvard. His colleagues, Rand et al., in 2012 published this paper that has gotten a lot of coverage in Nature, and was about spontaneous giving and calculated greed. And what they did is they calculated a one-shot Publix good game with groups of 4 participants. This was done online using 212 participants. And what they did is they would give each participant 40 US cents, and on each round they were asked to choose how much they wanted to contribute to a common pool. And any money that they contributed would be doubled by the experimenter, and then they could split among the 4 group members what the total proceeds were. So the idea here is in this public goods game is you're going to contribute to a common good. You could just give 10 cents, you could give 40 cents, you can give nothing, but whatever is in there is going to be doubled and then split among all 4 group members. And so you could just be a free rider here, right? You could just go ahead and put 0 cents in and not contribute at all, or you could contribute a lot and then contribute to the public good. Now, they did this under time pressure, or they did it with no time pressure at all while they made decisions, or there was some sort of delay. And what they found, as you can see in the graph here, is that when people had to do this under time pressure, they actually contributed more to the public good. When they had more time to think about it, or there was a longer delay between when they had to make a decision, you can see that people were less likely to contribute to the common good. It's almost like being forced by time to make a quick decision meant that people ended up contributing more to the common good and being a good person. In that study, by the way, Rand et al. Also looked at all sorts of other data that they had from other studies that come from the Green Lab, and they found that overall in all these other studies that when there was less time, people were more likely to be pro-social. So the overall finding here was that you would get faster decisions associated with more pro-sociality. And so the overall bottom line message of this research was that we're probably going to get more good behavior automatically. And if you give people time to think about things, they're not necessarily going to be good. They're going to have a controlled process that will step in. So it's sort of a positive message that maybe a lot of people actually are out there virtuous and good people. But I want you to also know that even though this is a highly cited study, like I said, it was in Nature and it's got a lot of attention, just like that other study I told you about before in political neuroscience, here's a study where someone tried to do a replication, and this was Bouwmeester et al., a Dutch group of researchers. And by the way, it's another Dutch team of researchers trying to do a replication. They published their paper in Perspectives of Psychological Science in 2017, and they attempted a registered replication with lots of labs around the world where they got 3,596 participants, gave people these kind of moral decisions to make very quickly, and found no effects of time pressure. So they were not able to replicate the effects that were talked about in this Nature paper. So I'll leave that there. Perhaps this isn't actually a real finding here that Green's group is reporting, in the sense that it's not something that's been replicable. And perhaps in the original studies it really did do that, but when you actually increase the sample size and try to look at it across lots of different labs, there isn't a whole lot of evidence for it. So perhaps the virtue of being good isn't really there as strongly as we might think. All right, so let's go on to our next theory of moral decision making, and that's deontology. And this is really, the deontology kind of comes from this word that means the study of duties or obligations. And it was promoted by Immanuel Kant, that you see here, who believed that we should figure out the rules of moral behavior based on our pure reasoning. And so to know how we should act, how we should behave morally, is just a matter of reasoning and thinking about things. We should figure out the right rules for some situation and then follow them. And part of the process is to imagine what everyone else would follow too, and this will tell you what the right thing is. And so sort of like the right rules will just become clear to us. They become apparent as we think and reason about what other people would do as well. And so following the right rules would mean then that you're acting morally. So if you have figured out what the right rules are for certain situations and then you follow them accordingly, that means you're acting morally. But if you don't follow those right rules, then you're not acting morally, according to Kant. Therefore, we would learn things like it's not okay to steal, it's not okay to harm people or kill people, it's not okay to cheat on your partner. These are all rules that we have figured out, we've learned. And whenever we follow those rules, that's our obligation, our duty is to follow these rules, we're acting morally. If we don't follow those rules, we're not acting morally. And then finally we get to utilitarianism and consequentialism. And here the focus is on the results. So this was developed by rather two strange philosophers, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. This is a branch of school of ethical philosophy that's called consequentialism, and which really only cares about the results or consequences of our actions. And so what Bentham and Mill argued is that the best action is the one that results in the most good and the least bad. In Bentham's words, utilitarianism means that the best action is whatever makes the most people happy. So what you have to do in order to figure out if some behavior or act is going to be a good one versus a bad one is to think about the consequences. What's going to happen, or what's going to make most people happy? Sure, there might be one person that's happy, but maybe a lot of other people will be unhappy by this action. Therefore, that's not a moral decision. You should be doing the thing that causes the most people to be happy. And so that's what we call utilitarianism or consequentialism. All right, so those are our three sort of theories of moral philosophy. And like I said, we're going to be focusing more on the last two. And we can look at moral decisions now at the neuro level and look at some of the research that's been done in the last 20 years in social neuroscience on this. Now, one of the most common problems to study moral decision making is to use the trolley car paradigm. And there's sort of like two key dilemmas here. One is the switch dilemma. This is also known as the bystander, and you've seen this before. The idea here is that a trolley is coming down that could actually kill 5 people who are somehow laying there on the tracks, and you can pull a switch and the trolley will go off and kill just 1 person instead of killing the 5. The other dilemma for the trolley car paradigm is the footbridge. And in the footbridge paradigm, you can stop the trolley from killing 5 people if you push the guy off the footbridge. This big guy will fall down in front of the trolley, causing it to derail and then save the 5 people. So in each of these dilemmas, you're going to only be killing 1 person in the dilemma to save 5 people, all right? And so those are the two dilemmas. And when you think about this now in terms of these last two theories of moral philosophy, the deontological versus the utilitarianism solution, you can see that from a deontology perspective, that in either case, you're going to be killing somebody. You're going to be killing the guy in the switch. You're going to be killing the guy that you push off the footbridge. And because, especially in the footbridge case, you're pushing him off with your own hands and causing his death, that's wrong, because we have a rule, which is that we're not supposed to harm people. And you're deliberately harming him, even though it's going to save 5 people, but you're harming him. And so the deontological situation would mean that you'd feel much more conflict about pushing him there than you do in the switch paradigm. The utilitarian solution is going to say, it doesn't really matter whether I pull the switch or I push the guy off the bridge. I'm saving 5 people. 5 people are going to be happy because I've saved their lives. Only 1 person is going to be unhappy. So if I pick a more utilitarian solution, that means that neither one of these dilemmas is particularly troublesome for me, because I don't actually have to, I can just focus on the fact that these 5 people are going to be saved. Now, in the fMRI context, it was first studied by Joshua Green and his colleagues at Princeton back in 2001. And you'll remember that when you watched in workshop week 3, the Alan Alda video, you'll remember that Joshua Green was there, I think either as a postgrad or maybe he was doing his postdoc at the time. He was sitting next to Cohen, and they were talking about these different moral dilemmas and the trolley problem, because I think right then he was in the midst of collecting those kinds of data that we're going to talk about now. So in that first study that was done in the scanner, that he did eventually get published in Science, so again, very high status journal. This is really quite the groundbreaking study when it was published. He hypothesized that footbridge case and other moral dilemmas that would be similar to it would cause more brain areas associated with emotion to become activated versus the switch case. So what he's suggesting here is a lot of people are actually probably quite deontological in their makeup, and even though they might be saving 5 people in either case, because of deontology, because it's something that we know is wrong to harm people, we have more of a problem harming the guy by pushing him off the bridge. And so he hypothesized you'd see more brain areas associated with emotion there. And so he ran 2 experiments, interestingly only 9 people in each study, in which participants would respond to each of 60 dilemmas while they're undergoing fMRI. And what you can see here is it says more personal and more impersonal. And I'll be showing you what some of these cases are, these dilemmas are in a little bit. But more personal would be dilemmas that are more like the footbridge case, where you are directly having to possibly harm somebody in order to save other people. And so the dark bars that you see here are when a person is being confronted with a more personal social dilemma or moral dilemma. A more impersonal one is like the switch case, where you can just pull the switch, but you're not actually pushing anybody, you're just pulling a switch. And so those would be the lines that you see there, those bars that are open. And also there's a third sort of control case where you have some non-moral decisions that need to be made. And what you can see is that whenever these more personal decisions were being presented to people, these more personal dilemmas, that areas that Green and his colleagues believed were associated more with emotion, things like the medial frontal gyrus, the posterior cingulate gyrus, the angular gyrus, and the angular gyrus right, all of those areas were much more activated for the dilemmas that involve more personal moral dilemmas. You can see over on the right part of the graph that areas of the brain that are associated more with working memory, more like executive control, more of like a sort of cold, hard reasoning of the facts. Those areas, things like the medial frontal gyrus, the parietal lobe, left and right, they were greater for the more impersonal moral decisions, as well as the completely non-moral decisions that need to be made. So the idea is that, sure, there's going to be there's some sort of dilemma that needs to be done even with something like the switch case, but that's done more through executive control, through working memories, through some more rational decision making, whereas the stuff about pushing a guy from a footbridge is more an emotional sort of decision, and so that's going to involve these more emotional areas of the brain. So that was that first study, and like I said, it was something that really launched a lot of people's interest or a lot of research into moral decision making in neuroscience. Now, since then, just as a sample, this is actually a little summary from a chapter that Green wrote in 2016. So he's writing this 15, 16 years after he had done that original study. And what he mentions in this chapter is that people with frontotemporal dementia, which leads to more emotional blunting, so people who have like strokes in their frontotemporal areas where they have some sort of dementia there, these people end up having more emotional blunting. They're not as emotional. And those people are 3 times more likely than controls to give consequentialist responses to the footbridge case. So they don't seem to struggle as much with the decision about pushing somebody off the footbridge as somebody who doesn't have this frontotemporal dementia. So they're making more of a quote-unquote rational decision. They're not seeming to worry as much about those sort of deontological concerns. Similarly, people with damage to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, people like Phineas Gage, are about 5 times more likely than controls to give consequentialist or utilitarian responses. And they show no skin conductance responses while they do. So again, with this damage to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, they're able to make these utilitarian decisions, sure, push the guy off the bridge, he'll save 5 people, without much of a struggle. There doesn't seem to be much skin conductance activity, much emotional activation while they do this. Low anxiety psychopaths are more likely than healthy people to give consequentialist responses. So that's interesting. People who score high in anxiety, high in psychopathy, but are low anxiety are more likely to pick this utilitarian response in these sort of kind of dilemmas. And then finally, people high in empathy are more likely to give deontological responses. So people who are just generally high as a trait of empathy, they're going to be more likely to have a struggle when they're pushing somebody off that bridge because they're thinking about the harm, the pain that this person will feel when he falls to the tracks. Now, these last couple responses, we're going to come back to talking about this at the end of this lecture about what is the role of empathy then in moral decision making, and I'll talk more about it at that point, but you can see here that already we're starting to see that empathy sort of leads to more deontological reasoning. Now, is there anything we can do further to kind of modify this deontological versus utilitarian thinking? Well, here's Molly Crockett. She has a lab at Yale University, and Crockett has looked at the role of serotonin in this kind of decision making. So this research started with the observation that the serotonin system innervates structures that are associated with moral judgment and behavior, like the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, but also the insula and the amygdala. And prior research had also shown that antisocial and aggressive behaviors are associated with impaired or reduced serotonin function. So what they did in this study, this paper that they published in 2010 was they manipulated serotonin in the participants by giving them a pill. Okay, and this pill was a highly selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, SSRI, called citalopram, okay, or citalopram. And citalopram boosts serotonin by blocking its reuptake and prolonging its effects at the synapse, which then therefore makes you have more of an emotional response if you have more serotonin out there in the synapse. Now, as a contrast, they also had their participants take a pill in another condition of atomoxetine, which is a neuroadrenaline reuptake inhibitor. And this should affect more executive control. It will cause you to have more of a rational cognitive response when you take this particular pill. So the participants in the study are actually going to go, it's a within subjects design, they actually go through a placebo condition, the citalopram condition, they also go through this atomoxetine condition. So they go through all three conditions, and it's counterbalanced across the study as they go through these different conditions. So what they did is they brought in 24 healthy participants who completed the study across 3 sessions, receiving either a single dose of atomoxetine, citalopram, or the placebo. And the testing was then timed to coincide with the peak effects of the drug. So they already knew about these doses of drugs where they have their maximal effects. And then that's around the time that they would have the maximal effect of the drug is when they would actually complete the testing. And they completed a moral judgment task where they were given scenarios and asked if this was acceptable to whatever. And I'm going to show you this moral judgment task. It's actually very similar to the moral judgment task that Green used in his 2001 study. Anyway, the participants, after they've completed that moral judgment task, then they would play an ultimatum game, supposedly with other students who had completed the study before. And again, their picture was taken so that they might be the proposer in a future game. But here, they're only going to be the recipient of proposals from other students. And then they completed measures of executive function, the participants did, things like a go, no task, and so on. And they also completed a trait measure of empathy. All right, so it's a pretty complicated study, but let's go ahead and talk about that moral judgment task. So this had been more formally developed by Green and his colleagues by 2004, and so it's something you can actually download and give to participants. So it's several tasks. I think it's something like maybe 36 different kinds of dilemmas, and then there are 3 categories of dilemmas. One category of dilemmas are the non-moral dilemmas, and what would happen is on a computer, a participant sits in front of the computer screen, and they get something like this. You are a farm worker driving a turnip harvesting machine. You are approaching 2 diverging paths. Okay. Then on the next screen it says, by choosing the path on the left, you will harvest 10 bushels of turnips. By choosing the path on the right, you will harvest 20 bushels of turnips. If you do nothing, your turnip harvesting machine will turn to the left. All right. Then the question is, on the third screen, is it appropriate for you to turn your turnip picking machine to the right in order to harvest 20 bushels of turnips instead of 10? So you can see they're making a decision, but it's not a morality decision, right? So in this dilemma and other dilemmas like this, there's nothing moral about the decision. Now here's an example of an impersonal moral dilemma. So here you are at home one day when the mail arrives. You receive a letter from a reputable international aid organization. The letter asks you to make a donation of $200 to their organization. The letter explains that a $200 donation will allow this organization to provide needed medical attention to some poor people in another part of the world. Then the question at the end is it appropriate for you to not make a donation to this organization in order to save money? And you would answer yes or no. And there are several of these impersonal moral dilemmas in the task. And finally, the other category is personal moral dilemmas. And these are going to be more like the footbridge version of the trolley paradigm. You are a doctor. You have 5 patients, each of whom is about to die due to a failing organ of some kind. You have another patient who is healthy. The only way that you can save the lives of the first 5 patients is to transplant 5 of this young man's organs against his will into the bodies of the other 5 patients. If you do this, the young man will die, but the other 5 patients will live. All right, so you can see this is much more a personal struggle here because you're going to kill this man in order to let the other 5 patients live. Is it appropriate for you to perform this transplant in order to save 5 of your patients? Yes or no? All right, so again, you can probably imagine the utilitarian choice. You can also imagine what the deontological choice would be. So what happens here? Remember in this study now, some of these participants are going to have serotonin. They might have that other atomoxetine that doesn't affect serotonin levels, but it might affect your working memory or executive control, or you have a placebo. And so we have the three categories of moral dilemmas here as a result. And you can see that there's no difference among the three neutral, in terms of the three conditions here, the placebo, the atomoxetine, or the citalopram, in terms of the proportion of people who judge that decision as acceptable. In the impersonal moral decisions, you see there's no effect there. But when we get to the personal, this is where we see differences between the three conditions. That is, the placebo, by the way, I should point out, all three of them are more likely to give a lower judgment of acceptability, right? So they all are showing less acceptance of that moral decision, but the placebo group is significantly higher in their acceptance of this than the atomoxetine, and the atomoxetine is significantly higher than the citalopram. So it turns out that citalopram, the one that's actually increasing serotonin, is causing people to be less consequential in their decision making and more deontological, right? So they're changing their moral dilemma, their moral reasoning to be more deontological and less consequential because of this increased serotonin. Now, the other question you can look at here is, remember that they gave everybody a measure of empathy and wanted to look at whether or not you were low or high in trait empathy. Does that seem to interact at all? And yes, it does. So what you can see here is that for just the conditions where we're looking at the personal moral decisions, right? That for people who are under low empathy, there's not really any effect here of the three different conditions. It's really only for the high empathy people. So people who are high in empathy are most affected by this added serotonin. And you can see that people high in empathy really become less consequential and more deontological. So there's the greatest effects of these drugs on people who are high in empathy. What about the other fact? You remember they played an ultimatum game where they could go ahead and receive offers from people that were either fair or unfair, and then you could accept or not accept the offer. And remember, when you don't accept the offer, that means that you don't receive any money, but it also means that the other person doesn't receive any money. So you're punishing them in a way at cost to you because you think the offer is unfair. So what happens with these three different conditions there? So what we've got here is the percent stake. So 45% means that basically they're mostly sharing the money equally with you, that you give them $10 and they're going to be more likely to share almost evenly with you about this. And most people accept those offers. But here in the middle, you can see this is when you got a 30% stake. So this is like when someone says they've received $10, so they're going to keep 7 and give you 3. Do you accept that or not? And what you can see there under these conditions, under this condition, that people who've had this citalopram, or that is they're going to have this boost in serotonin, are actually less likely to reject that offer than people who are in the placebo or in the other condition. So even though this is not a very fair offer, people who have increased serotonin accept it, and they don't punish the other person for the fact that they gave them an unfair offer. But when we get to 20%, this is where it's more like $8 they get to keep, $2 you get to keep. There isn't any difference again. So it's really only sensitive to this stake here where it's not so obviously unfair or so obviously fair that we actually see the differences between the different treatments. So that's kind of interesting. It kind of again suggests then that serotonin does actually have an effect. And in fact, how Crockett and her colleagues concluded this is they said that increasing serotonin with citalopram increases deontological thinking. People are more motivated to avoid harming someone else. And that, you remember the way that Kant would say that, you've learned this rule, I shouldn't harm people, and that becomes more salient to you in this kind of moral decision making. So that's why you don't want to harm people. Higher serotonin also then makes people more pro-social. We can see that they're more willing to accept those unfair offers, at least where there's like a 30% stake. And that these effects are greater in people who are high in trait empathy because perhaps they already have this neural signal propensity to not harm others, and it's just being egged on or being enhanced by having increased serotonin. Then the question, does this mean then consequentialism is doomed if you have high empathy and high serotonin levels? Like, are we not going to get rational utilitarian choices when people have high empathy and high serotonin? That seemed to be an implication from this study. Now we can look a little bit more about how all of this works in the brain in another study by Crockett et al. That was published in 2013. So this study combined that pharmacological technique with brain imaging. And so what they did is they studied the willingness of people to punish others who had violated their social norms of fairness. So it's again like in the ultimatum game where you can go ahead and choose to reject and punish the other person. They hypothesized in this study that they could reduce serotonin levels, and this would increase costly punishment by enhancing the subjective value of fairness and how this is represented in the ventral striatum and the medial prefrontal cortex. So instead of increasing serotonin this time, they reduced serotonin by having participants use this acute tryptophan deletion technique. Okay, so basically what you do is you drink a solution that lowers the tryptophan in your body. And when you lower the tryptophan, it causes then serotonin not to be produced as much. So it's sort of like a tryptophan blocker that deletes the tryptophan. So tryptophan is this precursor to serotonin, and by drinking this solution you could then lower the person's serotonin. It takes several hours for this to happen, but you drink this little cup and you wait, and then you'll find that the person's serotonin levels go down. And this was verified using blood samples. All right, so in this study again, they're going to be manipulating serotonin, but it's going down instead of up. So they had 28 healthy volunteers attend 2 experimental sessions where they either received the placebo or that ATD drink. So again, this is counterbalanced. Maybe 1 week you do the ATD drink that causes your serotonin levels to go down, or you do the placebo. And then after they take that drink, whether it's the placebo drink or the ATD drink, they then wait 5.5 hours reading or studying in a waiting room. It's quite committed participants here, right? So they come to the study, they're going to drink this solution, and then they got to wait around for 5.5 hours before they can actually do the actual experiment. And they gave a blood sample then, and then completed the fMRI scan. And during the fMRI scanning, they played the ultimatum game, in which, again, people using these photos made offers that were fair or unfair, and then the participant could then reject or accept the offers. And of course, when they're rejecting, they're not only punishing that other person, but it's costing them money, because when they reject it, they're not going to receive any money either, the participants. There were also some other tasks. This is a more complicated study than just what I'm telling you about here, but I'm just going to skip those and we'll move on to just looking at the ultimatum game response. So what happened here? Well, fairness of the offers was related to the ventral striatum in the placebo group, but not in the ATD. So you can see here down the lower left that when people were given fair offers, you see an increase in the ventral striatum whenever there was a fair offer. Like, so basically when they said, I'm going to keep $5 and give you $5, or I'm going to keep $6 and give you $4. Those are fair offers that the person's making to the participant, and that increased in the placebo group responses of the ventral striatum. You can see people who had ATD, that is, they had reduced serotonin, are not showing as that same sort of ventral striatum activity when they're given a fair offer. And then when we look at punishment or rejection offers, where they reject what the offer is that's given to them, this has to do with their dorsal striatum in the ATD group, but not in the placebo group. So whenever they rejected an offer, this is because they had more dorsal striatum activity going up here for the ATD group. And the more activation they had in the dorsal striatum, the more likely it was that they would reject the offer that was given to them. So it's sort of 2 different things here that are being evaluated. The ventral striatum is basically making judgments about how fair the offer is, but these people that have less serotonin are not really getting a sense of when something's fair, that they get like a little kick or a little positivity out of it. And more so, they're more likely to just retaliate to anything that's unfair with their dorsal striatum being more activated than people are in the placebo group. So the conclusion of this study was that depleting serotonin increases costly punishment by enhancing the motivational value of punishment. It's more like these people, because they have less serotonin, are more likely to think, I'm going to punish you for not being a fair person. So serotonin depletion increased activity in the dorsal striatum during punishment, and individual differences in the neural effects of that depletion were correlated with individual differences in the behavioral effects of the depletion. So it clearly shows us then across these two different studies the important role of serotonin, whether it's high, where we get more deontological reasoning, or if it's low and we have really low, much lower depleted levels of serotonin, we're more likely to be thinking of punishment and perhaps maybe making more consequentialist decisions. All right, let's move on now to the next topic, which is to look at moral decisions and genetics. And so I thought this is just an interesting study to bring up because we are looking at multiple levels of analysis in this course. And so here's a study that comes out of actually Green's lab. So it's Bernhardt et al., published in 2016. And they're looking at variation in the oxytocin receptor gene. Now, we already know from like Crockett's research that neurotransmitters are playing a role in moral judgments. So genes that produce or regulate these neurotransmitters should have influences then on moral judgment. So in two studies, where they had 228 and 322 participants in each of the two studies, they completed Green et al.'s moral judgment task. So all of the participants are going to go through all those different impersonal, personal, and non-moral tasks and make decisions about whether it's acceptable or not. They're also going to do some other tasks in this study, but this is the main thing, is we want to look at how they respond on this moral judgment task. And all the participants give samples of from their cheek swab for genetic testing, and therefore the researchers could then look at 25 SNPs of OXTR. So OXTR is a gene that encodes the oxytocin receptor protein. And there are several polymorphisms that have been identified that are associated with, for instance, autism spectrum disorders and deficits in social cognition. Some variations of the OXTR have also been found to be associated with more pro-social behavior, empathy, sensitive parenting, and theory of mind ability. Now, just like a lot of other SNP studies that were reviewed earlier in the semester by Sapolsky, there's a variety of findings here, and I wouldn't want to put a lot of money on any of these particular studies because right now it's been a bit of a crapshoot in terms of looking at just correlations across all these different variations. But it kind of makes sense to look at oxytocin because we know that oxytocin is going to be involved in more pro-social behaviors anyway, and so it kind of made sense here in this study that they would look at variations of that protein. So what they did, remember, is they could then look at these 25 SNPs and then look at correlations between them and what we see in terms of behaviors on, for instance, the personal moral dilemmas. And so what you can see here is that there was one SNP in particular, RS2378889, that's found on chromosome 3 and an intron of the OXTR gene, which is related to the number of copies of a minor allele in the OXTR gene called T. And then when you have more copies of that minor allele, that's negatively associated with more utilitarian responses. And so what this graph is showing you is how often did people give more utilitarian responses on those personal moral tasks, where they're more likely to say, what matters more is the good, not about harming somebody. And what we can see here is that we have people who don't have those alleles. So people who are CC means that they have the C allele for both, they have like double copies of the C allele, and those are people who are more likely to make utilitarian responses on these personal moral tasks. But people who have the double minor allele of double T, you can see that they are less likely to make utilitarian responses. In fact, they're making more deontological responses. So what this basically is showing us in just this very small way, looking at this one particular SNP, is that there is a relationship between this sort of genetic variation of the oxytocin gene here in terms of alleles. And if you have more copies of that allele T, you're more likely to make deontological decisions. And so in the conclusion of this paper, they say, only humans can contemplate moral dilemmas pitting the rights of the individual against the greater good. The present results indicate that our divergent answers to these complex philosophical questions can be explained, at least in part, by identifiable genetic differences. Now, that conclusion in some ways isn't that profound, because obviously one of the things you've learned about in this course is how much genetics contributes to so much of what we do. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that we'd find some genetic variation here. It's just a matter of how much this genetic variation is really contributing. I think it's interesting here that just on these moral tasks, you're seeing this. And again, perhaps it shows that maybe some people are more virtuous just by their genetics, and maybe there's some sort of support for the virtue ethics explanation for moral philosophy. Now, the next thing I want to tell you about is moral decisions and culture. And I want to talk just a little bit about how people look at these kinds of issues about culture, and just more generally how you can look at moral decision making. And a lot of these are done using public goods dilemmas. So these are situations in which the whole group could benefit if some of the members give something to the common good. This also means, by the way, you can have people who are free riders, right? So if there's a public good where we can all contribute and then we'll all benefit, there's no way of accounting for individual people pulling out of it. As long as enough people actually contribute to the common good, then we're all going to benefit from it, okay? Now, one of the specific kind of public goods that you hear a lot about is the tragedy of the commons. And so this is a particular type of dilemma where members of the group share this common good. However, there's like a finite amount of the resources available, and therefore it could be exploited. So this might be something where we each are going to pull something out of the common good, right? But if any of us takes a little bit more, or a little bit more selfish, then it's going to kind of tip it away, because the resource is only limited and we can't all benefit from it if we all are selfishly taking a lot out of it. And so here's an example, for example, of fishing, of the collapse of the Atlantic cod stocks off the east coast of Newfoundland back in 1992. And you can see in the years precipitating that, basically how much fish was being fished out of this area. And then when you get to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there's a lot more fishing going on. There's much more taking this cod out of the area. And by 1992, all of a sudden, it just crashes and there's hardly any of these cod. And that's because basically it was overfished, right? There was over exploitation. Too many of these fishermen were taking too many of the cod, and the cod weren't able to reproduce fast enough, and boom, you're gone, we're out of it. So that's the tragedy of the commons. That's why it's a tragedy, because people are so selfish that they take it all away. So you can look at public goods dilemmas without doing the tragedy of the commons. You can also look at it from the tragedy of the commons. And there's a lot of really interesting research that's been done in anthropology, in economics, in psychology, looking at these sort of moral dilemmas. All right. Now, the one I want to focus on here is a study that was published by Herman et al. Back in 2008, and it was again published in Science. So again, it's a well-known study. And what happened here was that participants played a public good dilemma with people from around the world, and it was anonymous. So they're on the computer playing a public goods dilemma, where they could give money to a common pool again, and then they could actually possibly show an increase, because the experiment could increase the amount of money that was, like doubling the amount of money in a common pot, and then would be shared with everybody else. But what happened here is that after each round, you could actually find out if any of the particular people in your group hadn't contributed money to the common good. So you would, first of all, like the way the round begins is that you each make your contribution. And you don't really know who these people are, but they're all given like anonymous person number 1, anonymous person number 2, and so on. And then afterwards, after everybody's made their contribution and you find out what the common good was and how much money you're all going to be able to share now afterwards, it's then that you find out what each person individually contributed. And then that way you could find out whether or not anybody's a free rider. That is, maybe somebody who didn't give very much money into this is now benefiting a lot, whereas maybe other people like you, your participant, you actually did put a lot into it. And so what happened then is then you were free then to punish those free riders by taking away some of their money. And so what you see here in this graph are people from different cities around the world in terms of how much they would punish the free riders, okay? So how much did they punish them? And you can see that pretty much all of the cultures are doing punishment of the free riders, right? So you can see that everybody punishes the free riders. If there are any free riders, they do this. But the other problem was that people down at the bottom are also punishing individuals who didn't free ride, who did actually give a lot of money to the common good. So you can see down here at the bottom, some of these other cultures are also punishing people who didn't free ride, but instead contributed to the common good. So what's interesting is that some of these cultures down at the bottom, where people were really quick to punish, there was also then never a lot of cooperation ever. The people up at the top, the Boston, Melbourne, Nottingham groups, they did do punishment of free riders. And what that would normally do is cause the free rider to then contribute more on the next round. So free riders would have some of their money taken away, and now when they were given a chance on the next round to contribute to the common good, they were more likely to do that. And so you saw a lot of cooperation in those cultures that you see in the kind of the top half of the graph. Down in the bottom half, these were cultures where you just didn't see much cooperation ever. The lower you get on the graph, the less cooperation there was. And so they were not only punishing the free riders, but they were also punishing, like I said, people who were contributing to the common good. And so when they debriefed the participants and asked them why are you punishing people who are given to the common good, the answer was, well, they shouldn't be giving to the common good because we don't know who those people are. We don't know who these people are in this group. They're all strangers. They're not part of my tribe, obviously, because I don't know them. And so because I don't know them, I think it's wrong to be contributing to a common good. So they believed much more in sort of a common good if it's just your tribe only. And it's not, remember, they know that these are people from all over the world that are participating with them. And so if they believe that that contributing to the common good here with people who are not part of your tribe is happening, they don't like that. And so they don't want to participate in a cooperative situation with people who don't belong to their quote-unquote tribe, to their own in-group. And that was especially so for these cultures that you see down at the bottom. So this tries to show us then that it's much more the case that culture is actually contributing a lot to moral decision making about how much we're going to believe in deontological responses. A lot of that deontology, remember, has to do with how you imagine how other people would respond to this particular situation. And so if you're in a culture where you can imagine the other people in your culture wouldn't do X or wouldn't act in this particular way, that might be a very important reference then in terms of your deontological reasoning versus a more utilitarian response where you just worry about the final consequences. So I bring all of this up, and it's going to be talked about in a video that we're going to watch in the workshop by Green. But it's really interesting to think about how there's a lot of cultural variation in these public goods dilemmas. It's not all just genetics and evolution. Culture obviously plays a huge role in what is moral and what is not moral. All right, I want to finish up this lecture with this problem or question about the problem with empathy. And I have here problem with a question mark because it's something we'll talk more about at the next lecture where we talk about empathy. Anyway, this has to do with this kind of complex relationship between morality and empathy. DeSetti and Cowell talked about this in 2014 in a really interesting article in Trends in Cognitive Sciences. They've mentioned here that, remember that we have already mentioned that people high in trait empathy are more likely to make deontological decisions, okay? So this is a point I'm saying that I already mentioned earlier in this lecture, that people who have high trait empathy are more likely to make deontological decisions, not those nice utilitarian consequentialist decisions, right? And so that's something that DeSetti and Cowell talk about in the 2014 paper. And at times, then empathy guides our moral judgment. That's kind of clear. Yet other times, it can interfere with it. It could actually cause us not to make a decision that could benefit a lot more people if you think about it from a consequentialist point of view. Another thing about empathy is it is a limited resource. We don't just give our empathy to everybody. We are quite stingy with our empathy. Children, for example, don't display empathy toward all people equally. And when you look at older children and adults, they tend to more easily give their empathy to people who are related to them or people who are in their in-group, right? So we don't just give empathy to everybody, and therefore that could interfere again with our morality, especially when we're talking about people who don't belong to our group. And finally, they point out in this article that both empathic concern and moral reasoning involve the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And this suggests, in their reasoning, that morality, these decisions that we've been talking about in this lecture, piggyback on older evolutionary mechanisms that are associated with parental care. So perhaps what we've done, again, is sort of thinking about this in terms of spandrels and the way that we kind of reuse older evolutionary modules in our thinking, is that our morality is sort of based on mechanisms that have to do with the way we take care of those who are genetically related to us. And so they talk about this in terms of looking at what they know at that time in 2014. And again, some of this is some stuff I've already brought up earlier in this lecture, that lesions in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex are associated with more utilitarian choices and moral dilemmas, that when we view others being harmed, we get more activity in the PSTS and the medial prefrontal cortex, and more empathic concern that's associated with ventral medial prefrontal cortex. We also know, as I mentioned earlier, that a lack of empathic concern is associated with psychopathy, and that psychopaths show no activation of the ventral medial prefrontal cortex when they're imagining the pain of another person. So here's an interesting link, right? So you kind of think of people who are psychopaths as not having a lot of moral guidance. They do a lot of immoral things, and they also show a lack of empathic concern. And this is all rooted again in the activation or the lack of activation in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So they finished that article by saying that the ventral medial prefrontal cortex appears to be a critical hub for both moral behavior and empathic concern. And so that's going to lead us then to the next lecture, where we talk more about where empathy comes from. I also want to just mention that Paul Bloom has written a really good book about all this, where he's argued that having too much empathy is a bad thing. He wrote this in this book called Against Empathy that was published in 2016. He says that empathy is limiting because it directs people's attentions to individuals or individual events, which can then misguide certain acts of kindness, because we get so wrapped up in our morality about maybe a dog that's hurting or a small child who's crying that we then miss other things around us that maybe have bigger moral consequences. And so he argues that having too much empathy causes moral blindness, he calls that. And some of what he's actually arguing then fits in with consequentialism. He believes that people can make decisions based on considerations of cost and benefits. So I think he's sort of arguing then that having too much empathy is making us too deontological, and therefore if we could reduce the empathy or try to train ourselves not to have so much empathy, we can be more consequentialist in our thinking. And so he argues in this book in terms of what he calls rational compassion, which is, feeling and understanding that other people need help, but we do this more rationally. We do it more consequentially or utilitarian in the way that we approach it. So I'll save all this, or bring it back up again when we get to the next lectures on empathy. But for now, I want to end, and you remember that we did talk about some philosophy in this lecture. We talked about moral decisions at the neural level. We've talked about moral decisions in genetics, moral decisions in culture, and finally we talked about the problem with empathy in terms of how it might influence our moral decision making. So that's all I have for this lecture. I'm looking forward to talking to you about empathy in the next 2 lectures. And that's all I have for now.